existence. Why is there order? Because God made order. Look at verse 5. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Look at that sentence. There was evening, and there was morning the first day. That's order. Why do I bring that out? Because you and I measure evening and morning by the earth spinning on its axis, right? The sun comes up, that's morning. The sun goes down, that's evening. And why does it do that? Because the earth is spinning as it's navigating around the sun. But there is still no earth yet in the created order in the first day. There's a void. There's emptiness. And yet, there is still evening and morning the first day. What? You see, the intentionality of the interval of evening and morning comes before the celestial bodies are ever created. Oh, wow, well, that must be an anachronism, says the literature major. People of that era didn't know that the earth actually spun underneath the sun. And so that's why they wrote it this way. Maybe. Or maybe the creation story shows us that this is actually an intentional act. God creates out of nothing, out of void, out of emptiness, out of confusion, and he creates something that isn't there before at all. And in so doing, God creates, and what do we see in this? Time. The first organizational interval. He creates time where time never existed before. How could God be infinite? Well, you can be infinite if you're outside of time. As the inventor of time, he would be outside of time. And so that's the first organizational structure, the first day. And what does this order then tell us? It means that the world is not the result of chance. It's not the result of accident. Time didn't come because the earth was created. Time was invented first, and then the earth was created. It's not a result of random forces. There's intentionality behind it. After all, how could randomness create order? It's a basic question. It's foundational. We should all be asking that. It would be easy to presume that pure chance is making the earth spin the way it spins, not too fast so that, the water doesn't all leave the earth's surface, but not too slow so that we don't all bake on one side and freeze on the other, right? It's very important that it spins at the right speed. But there was evening and there was morning the first day. That means the cycle of the earth spinning is governed by God and his administration of time, not by the earth. God creates the interval, and so therefore the earth is obeying it, not itself. The earth is still formless and void, right? I mentioned that already. In fact, the whole universe is still formless and void. And yet time now exists. And that brings us then into the rest of these verses that I want to look at today. The next few verses reveal. Verse 6, God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day." Now, if you can't, within that passage, see God organizing things, I don't know how to help you at this point, but first he separates light from dark, and then he creates time, and then he creates an expanse. What's an expanse? Well, it's a gap. But I thought you said that nothing already existed. Isn't a gap nothing? Well, no. Yes, I did say that nothing existed and that nothing can't exist, and so therefore there was nothing there, and a gap would technically be an absence of something. But no, in terms of what we're dealing with here, the gap is not an absence of something. He separates. What he's doing is he's putting distance between something. That's a gap. He separates the confusion below from the confusion above. Remember what we said about the waters of the deep? The waters of the deep is Hebrew poetry, meaning it's chaos. It's unknowable chaos. That's what nothingness is, unknowable chaos. But he separates the confusion below from the confusion above. He places a gap in between, an expanse. This is kind of like taking two dogs that are fighting, right? You see two dogs that are fighting and the owners are immediately pulling back on the leashes, pulling those dogs away from each other. What do? They create a gap, an expanse between those two angry dogs, right? Does anything change with those two angry dogs? Not at all. They're still two angry dogs trying to get at each other. But now there's a gap between these two angry dogs. So it says here in verse 7 that God called the expanse, the gap, heaven. Oh, rats. I have to call out the ESV again. Capital H, heaven. I think it's a very unhelpful capital, if I can say that. In the Hebrew, there are no capital letters. Let's just put that out there. First and foremost, we need to understand there's no such thing as a capital letter in Hebrew, in the language at all. And so for us to put a capital letter in is to make an interpretive decision. Now, we do that all the time. Some translations will capitalize every instance and every occurrence when it says son, when it's referring to Jesus, right? That's an interpretive decision, capital S, because we want everybody to know this is a particular son who happens to also be part of the Trinity and God of the universe, right? We make those kind of interpretations all the time. But putting a capital H here is a little bit difficult in terms of its interpretation. Because when you put the capital H, what you're saying is God separated the earth from that glorious place that we're going to be in the future, where God presently resides with all of his angels. That's what we think of when we see capital H, heaven. But I don't think that's what's going on here in this text at all. You see, the word in the Hebrew is samayim. And samayim is used predominantly throughout Scripture to refer to the sky and the heavens in terms of where the celestial bodies are. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but what I think is going on here is that God is creating an expanse, a gap, and he's putting it into place, and that gap is ultimately the place where all of the celestial bodies will go. They're out there, right? If you go out at night and you look up at the night sky, if you get out of the city and get away from light pollution, that is, and you look up at the night sky and you see all those stars, it looks kind of like an expanse, doesn't it? Does to me. So God created this space. He created a gap, an expanse. So when you look again at the passage, he separates the waters with it. And remember what we said about those waters, right? The waters are this Hebrew expression of chaos. So what God is ultimately doing is he's separating chaos above the expanse and chaos below the expanse. He begins by organizing these two areas, or these two nothingnesses, separating them from each other. That's an organizational structure. As you progress through the Genesis story, the narration immediately forgets the upper expanse. It doesn't concentrate or focus on that for a really long time. And the scientists would say, okay, well, if the expanse is the universe, then what's the chaos above the expanse? I don't know. You guys haven't seen the edge of the universe yet. Well, you haven't. So I don't know what the chaos is. Nothingness? You see, this is what's going on in the story. Presumably, God isn't organizing, and he has no interest in organizing, at least as far as we're concerned, the chaos above the expanse. The whole rest of the narrative focuses on the chaos and organizing the chaos below the expanse, the nothingness that is below the expanse. So there's the organization. There's light and dark. There's above, and now there's below. And then, as you proceed into the passage, you continue on in the narrative, he gathers the waters, he separates the land from it. Do you see what he's doing? He's creating spaces. The first 3 days, all God is doing is creating spaces. He creates an expanse. He creates light and dark first, then he creates an expanse, then he creates seas, then he creates land. That's the first 3 days of creation. Do you know what he does in the next phase of creation? He fills each one of those spaces that he created. Day 4, he creates all of the celestial bodies. Day 4, I thought light was created in day 1. How can there be light without sun? You're so dependent on the world that you know. I don't know, but he did through his revelation of himself. He created a distinction between light and dark. So now he creates the sun, moon, and stars. He fills the expanse. He creates sea creatures and birds to fill the seas that he created and the air above it. And then he creates crawling animals on day 6 to fill the land. We're crawling animals. Not really. We'll get to there in a couple of weeks. But look at that. It's all incredibly organized. When you look at what he's doing, it's all incredibly organized and it's spoken into existence. God didn't have to work at this. He didn't have to sit there and count one for you, one for me. It was all, he just spoke it and it happened. It was organized and it was there and it was good. But note that God doesn't just make a gap and then fill it like I might do with all of my trash, right? No, he makes intentional gaps. They're intentional. How do we know they're intentional? Because God organizes his creation using names.